morning and welcome to the 29th meeting of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee for 2019. We've received apologies from committee member Andy Whiteman. The first item on the agenda, item 1, is a decision by the committee to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are we agreed? Yes. Thank you. We now turn to our consideration of the Consumer Scotland Bill, and we have with us today a number of witnesses. From my left to right, first of all, Jane Adams, who is the chairperson of Chief Officers of Citizens Advice Bureau Scotland. Then Anne Lavery, Deputy Chief Executive, Citizens Advice Scotland. Derek Mitchell, Chief Executive, Citizens Advice Scotland. And last but not least, Rory Mayer, who is the Chair of Citizens Advice Scotland. So welcome to all four of you this morning. If I might ask, or perhaps say, first of all, the sound desk will operate the microphone, so no need to press any buttons. If you want to come in on any question, simply indicate by raising your hand and I'll try to bring you in. Obviously, you don't all need to respond to every question, so we can just let the matters flow as a discussion as members of the committee come in to ask about various matters. If I might start perhaps by asking what CAB does at the minute in providing consumer advice specifically, and also what it does in terms of campaigning on consumer issues. So if one or other of you might wish to answer that. I think Rory Mayer has volunteered himself.
I'll start, Chair. I think that the first thing to say is that in Scotland, at the moment, we are by far the biggest provider of consumer advice and advocacy, with over 250,000 pieces of information provided every year. So no other agency provides more advice than we do through our network of bureau at the length and breadth of the country. And what we then do is to advocate on behalf of consumers on the issues they raise with us. So we're very clear that our approach to consumer advocacy is a lived experience of citizens' approach. It's not, it's citizens themselves that tell us what's important to them, and we take that forward. And we think that's an important element of any consumer advocacy and support mechanism, is that we actually listen to what is bothering citizens and we then advocate on those things. I think a common misconception, which I recognise is perhaps in our name, is that we're only an advice agency. Since we were formed 80 years ago, we had two objectives. One is giving advice, and the other is advocating on behalf of citizens on those issues that they bring to us. So right at the heart of what we do across the Citizens Advice Network is this idea that we give advice and then we advocate on those things that are important to citizens. And that's absolutely crucial in our view of this bill.
I suppose what people need, though, is somewhat broader than that, because there may be issues that people are not aware of that they don't raise with you as general issues.
Yes.
How do these matters then come to fore? Because there are plenty of things, I would imagine, I think, that people, if they knew about, might have an issue with.
Yes, and I think that's, in some senses, the issue for this bill, that we have said in our submission that one of the reasons we support the idea of Consumer Scotland is that there probably does need to be some broader-based research approach that tries to say, how do we identify where consumer detriment might happen, and how do we make sure it doesn't happen? And that we recognise that as an agency focused on citizens and their experience, that's not our primary purpose. However, it's fair to say that we do research as CAS in order to try and identify with providers of service other areas where consumer detriment might happen, and we work with big providers of service to try and make sure that their systems actually mean that consumers won't be damaged.
I'm just wondering if any other member of the panel might want to comment particularly on my second question. Derek Mitchell.
Yeah, I agree with what Rory said about Consumer Scotland and that filling a potential gap around that. But essentially the consumer, actually, people don't see themselves as consumers or citizens, they see themselves as people. So when they come in to our cab service and tell us what's happening in terms of them being in detriment in their communities. We then pick that up, and as Rory says, we can then validate what people are saying in communities to be saying, does this happen in Aberdeen, is it happening in Inverness, is it happening in Edinburgh, is it happening in Glasgow, is it happening in Ayrshire? If it is, then it's an issue for us. So I think we wrote to the committee to talk about a few things that we have done around that with parcel surcharging. Funeral poverty is a really good example where it's no, the utility for this isn't just somebody that finds themselves in funeral poverty at that time. It's the changes that we have made by shining a light on funeral poverty that mean that the utility is for, you know, other people who struggle when a relative dies, to be able to afford to bury them gracefully. So there's a whole range of things that we do. Your Bus, Your Say campaign, I think Jane, you know, in her cab brought that to us. Essentially, buses either stopped being in operation in an area or they were infrequent, and that meant that social isolation, people getting access to job centres to try and get back into work, people getting access to the jobs market generally was much, much more difficult. So these are things that all come from the lived experience. But I don't think people come in saying at that time, I've got a consumer issue.
Come in, then I was going to come to Gordon MacDonald, who I think wants to follow up on some of these points. Jane Addams.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Derek and Rory had said from the Bureau perspective on this, and exactly that in the strength of the network. If we use the buses, it was something that we identified in Aberdeenshire as being an issue, and what the strength of the network allowed us to do is find out, is this a bigger issue across the country, and then take out that advocacy campaign around it.
All right, Gordon MacDonald.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. There's no doubt that Citizens Advice provides a valuable service, but unfortunately you don't have any presence in my constituency, so I have to send constituents occasionally halfway across the city to try and get some kind of support from you guys. What I'm keen to understand in terms of the gaps that you highlighted in the consumer support network that you were talking about is, looking at the website, the CAS website, you highlight 6 areas that you are involved in providing advice: benefits, debt and money advice, work-related problems, housing, relationships, and consumer issues. What proportion of your workload is consumer issues?
We deal, as Rory said, with about 240,000
Figures
issues.
I've got is 272,000 clients.
Yes, and for all of those clients, as Rory said, I suppose that's the virtue that we see of the service that we offer, because as we've been clear, we don't really see people as citizens or consumers, they're just people, and people will often come in with, on average, it's about 7 different issues that they come to our Citizens Advice Bureau with. Now, some of that might be fuel poverty, which is effectively a consumer issue, but that might be because they haven't got their benefits as a result of some universal credit issue. So for us, it's looking at the person in the round. So, as I say, the 240,000 is the pieces of advice that we provide. The 270 odds is the number of clients, but with the benefit of this, the advice that we provide is that it doesn't look at people as one or the other. I think we have done some work recently, though, that looks at the proportion of advice that we give that's specifically consumer related. And at its most minimum, because we've tried to take a pretty conservative look so that we're not providing an unfair analysis, but at its minimum, it's a third.
So roughly a third.
Roughly a third, and as I say, but that third will be people that also have other issues, and I think that is the virtue of the service, that people can come to one place and just have their problem solved rather than be categorised as a citizen or a consumer.
No, I mean, I accept that people have got a range of problems.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. So roughly 90,000 people a year you're helping that have got consumer issues.
That would be their primary issue.
Yeah, it's consumer related issues.
Absolutely, yeah.
In terms of the Audit Scotland report on protecting consumers, it says that, well, we heard last week that £8 billion a month is spent in Scotland by consumers. Roughly 100 billion a year is spent by consumers. And the Audit Scotland report says that 1.3 million people in Scotland who think they have reason to complain about goods and services bought in the last year, when this report came out a couple of years ago. So would you agree that there appears to be a large gap in support for consumers, given that the Audit Scotland report says there's 1.3 million people a year that have probably got problems with consumer issues, and you're dealing with roughly 70,000?
I think it would be fair to say that the people that we're talking about are the people that access our services through the Bureau predominantly. What we do see is a much larger proportion of people that access our services through our website. So a lot of those people that you're referring to may be people that can self-help and simply need advice through the public-facing advice site that allows them to then empowers them to go and solve their own problems. So I'm not saying that there's not a gap, but I think it's probably smaller than the figures might indicate, because people self-serve and find other ways to access the advice through our network as opposed to simply coming in. And that's what we've been very keen to do over the last number of years, is to make sure that we can provide advice to people in a way that suits them. That might be face-to-face in a local constituency, it might be over the phone, or it might be accessing advice on a website that they can then use to help to solve their problem.
Yeah, you talked about web access, etc. Scottish Government commissioned Advice Direct Scotland to provide telephone and web advice on consumer issues. How's that impacted on CAB, or do you work in tandem, or how does that relationship work?
I mean, we're still the biggest provider of consumer advice in Scotland, despite the removal of that contract. So we continue to provide that consumer advice through our bureaus, through our extra help unit, and through a telephony offering.
Right. Chair, I think there is another issue there, which is that prior to that situation, we did provide that service. The difficulty is that a telephony service, by its very nature, signposts people somewhere. Yeah. And where in fact it signposts people is to us. So what that creates is that people are phoning one agency and being told that the answer to their problem lies with somebody else. And we know that people don't like being pushed from one place to another. So for those people who can get the resolution to their problem simply by access to a website, and I recognise there are a number of those, that works very well. For the great number of people who will not get their problem resolved simply by access to a website, then they have to be referred somewhere else. And at the moment, we're the place to whom those people are referred.
Okay.
I think Derek Mitchell wanted to, and then Jane Addams, perhaps, just on these points.
Yeah, I think just maybe going back a bit on what Anne was saying, I think if that link between, we talk about this interdependencies between citizens and consumers and advice and advocacy, but that link for people is that when they're living with a limited income and their washing machine breaks, it's a consumer issue, or their boiler breaks and they can't get work, they've got a choice to make quite often, because they've not got any spare money to have their wains gone to school with dirty clays, or to get their washing machine fixed. And by fixing the washing machine, they might not be able to pay their rent that week, or their council tax. That's so people seamlessly don't see themselves in compartmentalise between different things, and that's what we find, as Anne said earlier. By the time people come to see us, there's normally about 7 different issues, and the beauty of providing services is we're working very hard to do, and providing service to people when they want, where they want, how they want, is that when we see some of the national projects that we're delivering just now, where somebody's on a web chat because they think they've got a very simple question that can be answered pretty simply, and when that web chat, conversation takes place, it becomes clear that there are many other issues. So somebody can just seamlessly say, "Are you okay if I just, pick up the phone to you?" Yeah. And then sometimes they pick up the phone to you. So there's a range of issues in your life that need resolved. Can make an appointment to come in and see us. And it's that triage of service that I think that's really, really important for us. It's about, providing information, advice, advocacy and redress. It's about solving people's problems first time when they come to us. That's where we're going. That's where we want to do.
Okay.
On a practical point around face-to-face consumer advice within communities, it's worth making the note that over the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen a reduction in the direct funding being put into local cabs for consumer advice, and yet we've managed to maintain the levels that we have, the 250,000 issues advised on, and the generalist advice, and we've been able to do that through our network of over 2,000 volunteers giving high quality advice. But it's just something to note around, we have maintained this despite funding not being put into face-to-face advice around consumer issues.
But the majority of your funding comes from either local authorities or the UK government, is that right?
So locally, for the local bureau, it's from local authorities, yes. And local authorities have been more specific with how they want their funding to be used, and often bureaus are finding that's not covering consumer advice.
Okay, thanks very much.
Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Convener. The committee understands that some of the advocacy work that you carry out is going to be transferred to Consumer Scotland. I'm thinking of your policy units on energy, on post, on water. There's no reference to this in the policy memorandum at all, so I'm wondering where you've got to in your discussions with the government. Are you able to discuss the extent of that transfer at this stage? And if so, what's the likely impact going to be on Citizens Advice Scotland? And I'm looking at Derek first. If
Do you want to start?
Yeah,
oh,
I'll start.
Rory will start.
I'll start.
Perfect.
I'll come in.
I mean, I think that the first thing to say is you've identified exactly the worry we've got, which is that if this new agency does the things that it said in the consultation, which is strategic high-level activity that we don't have a problem. If it does what we already do, we don't see how that adds any value to what consumers would experience. We do that to a high standard. We've got good relationships with big providers that allow us to do that to a high standard, and simply transferring it around doesn't seem to us to make much sense. I also think that we are really worried about that because the resources that make up our total ability to support consumers need to be maintained. And if you take any bit of that out, it's not just the bit that you take out that will suffer. It's our ability to do the work as a national resource and to support the cabs properly. So you've identified exactly what we're worried about. If this new agency does the things it said it would do, intervene in markets to make them more consumer friendly, high-level research that nobody else does, big campaigns and the dealing with complaints. We've supported that, and that's what our submission to you says. We support that. If it begins to say, well, actually, we want to do what you do already, we've got a real worry about that as to why you would do that, and also the effect it will have on us in terms of the resources we would lose. So, and as in terms of our discussions with the Minister, it would be fair to say that we've got a little bit of reassurance at a very global level that, of course, there's no intention to do that. But because there is very little specifics in the bill that says exactly how this new agency is going to behave, we're worried that what we create is an agency that then, once it's formed, seeks to find its own place, and its own place might impinge on what we do. And all we're looking for is assurances through this process that that will not happen.
Okay. Derek.
Yeah, I mean, following that, for us, we're supportive of a new body that does some of the things I think that some of your colleagues have already pointed out in a more systematic way, and involves itself and puts consumers at the heart of decision making, you know, just as the Public Sector Equalities Duty has and the Fair Scotland Duty, and we think that those are really good things. So that top-down approach can then meet our bottom-up lived experience approach, and there's some discussion around how that abuts in the middle. But if the new body comes into operation and it's left up to the new Chief Executive and Chair to decide how it's going to operate in what is already quite a well-defined consumer protection environment in Scotland, then I would think that would be a waste of public money. When it could be doing the things that we, and I think Scottish Government, I think the ministerial intention would be that it does, and it focuses it and it really adds value. If it comes in and, you know, tries to muscle its way into different things, and by its very nature, if you're going to intervene in markets and systems, it's a medium to long-term thing. Our worry is that they will need to come back and, I would imagine, respond to you guys after the first year and say, what have you done? And the visibility of that, they might have done a lot of really, really good things, but the visibility of that won't be immediately apparent. And the danger would be that they look for some low-flying fruit. And we're at.
But at the moment, you have nothing, if I'm picking you up right, on paper, never mind in a policy memorandum or on the face of the bill, that gives you that reassurance.
What the reassurance we've got from the Minister is around the initial money that we felt we were going to be losing. We won't be losing that anywhere near that amount of money. And the reassurance is that the Minister's view is that this new body should operate at that level. And I think the Minister has reassured us that he respects, values and trusts what we do. And that's into the future is the case as well.
So just to... I'm clear, there's no staff transfer, there's some resource clawback, is what you're describing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's too early to say whether there'll be any staff transfer. I think we can't give a definitive answer on that at the moment. I don't think there'll be much, because as Rory says, if this new body's genuinely going to do the things it's going to do, our people-based advocacy is what our people-based advocacy is, and it works very, very well. And industry in the main, they like it at times, they don't like it other times when we put consumers' interests, and particularly vulnerable consumers' interests at heart. So it's a bit early to say that, but there may well be something in the middle there, because we get money, for example, for national research, for example, that may well legitimately sit with Consumer Scotland in the future, and we're still working with that through officials.
Okay. Jane Addams, you indicated you wanted to...
Yes, I just wanted to add that from the network, from Local Bureau, we are concerned that any changes, around Consumer Scotland Bill, and, I'm not party to any conversations that Derek and Rory are having, but what we would be concerned about is a reduction in resource to CAS will affect Local Bureau's ability to carry out social advocacy work and social policy work. And I wouldn't want that to be missed within this, is that what's happening at this level isn't going to have an impact on Local Bureau and the advocacy that we're doing. We can't do it without CAS's support. They can't do it without us and the client-facing role that we're doing. And I just think it's important to capture that through these conversations.
Okay. So it's clarity either on the face of the bill or in writing somehow to provide that reassurance.
Yes.
Thank you, Convener.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Mention's been made of the extra help unit and the fact that CAS provides support to energy and postal customers across the country through that unit. How do you anticipate directly that will be affected? But I'm also interested in how much of the work done in relation to particularly energy and postal customers that are consumer-led, and how much is sort of higher level advocacy.
In terms of your first question in relation to the extra help unit, that is an integral part of the service that we offer. As you say, it provides advice to vulnerable post and energy consumers, and often those who are at risk of being cut off. So it's a huge part of the advice offering that we provide, because often, as we have said, those that are at risk of having their energy cut off are also those that are struggling to put food on the table. So having the extra help unit as part of the Citizens Advice Network means that we can not only help those people with their energy issues, but we can then do a warm transfer across to the Bureau, who can help them with their wider issues. And in the opposite direction, people that come into the Bureau can access that expertise that we have within the extra help unit, which is a GB-wide service which runs out of Scotland. So we have sought exactly the reassurances that you've asked there from both Scottish and UK government, because it's a joint funded unit, to say, do you see this as being part of the Citizens Advice Network going forward? And they have both given us the assurances that they do see that as being an integral part of our service, and that there are no plans to remove that from the Citizens Advice Network at the present time. Sorry, your second question, I think, was...
The second question was really about how much of the work done in this unit, particularly in relation to energy and postal customers, is actually consumer-led, and how much is higher-level advocacy?
So obviously the unit itself provides that advice to the consumer at the point that they need it to ensure that their energy doesn't get cut off. What we do is that data that we have access to then is fed into a data hub that we have constructed, because we are the biggest, we own the biggest data set outside the public sector on individuals, and so we can feed that in and we can link that with the data that we have from the Bureau to understand and to advocate on those issues that impact most on people. So again, it's about taking the information that comes from the extra help unit and amalgamating it with the wider Bureau data, which allows us to pick up on patterns, so to begin to see fairly early where those patterns emerge. And obviously through the extra help unit, we do have those relationships with the service providers, with the energy providers, as we do through our advocacy work on the energy side. So it's a kind of virtuous circle of advice that highlights patterns of detriment, that allows us to advocate through the wide data set that we have on people's behalf, and solve problems not just immediately for the client and for those that are affected, but also to highlight those issues through campaigns to people that, as somebody said earlier, might not be aware of the issue, but then becomes aware of it through the campaigns.
I suppose what I'm trying to understand is how big the actual advocacy service is within this unit. So how much, you're obviously funded by the UK government and by the Scottish government, how much of the funding or the resources are used in order to advocate on behalf of the wider issues as opposed to the consumer-led issues?
So we have an impact team, as we call it, which is effectively our policy and advocacy unit. Now that is part funded, as you say, both from UK government and from Scottish government, because it deals with citizen and consumer issues. And I suppose it comes back to the point that we've made. It's about people, and it's about campaigning on the issues that impact on people. So the funding that's proposed to potentially move into the new body would be the funding that's used to support the delivery of that entire advocacy offering that the Citizens Advice Network provides. I don't know if that answers your question, or
only partially.
Okay.
So how much of that money? How much would that money be? And still, how much of the resources are pointed at the consumer-led issues, and how much at the advocacy?
Yeah. In practice, it doesn't separate like that. I mean, for us, the importance of the extra help unit is that there's a practical day-to-day thing, and they stop disconnection. So self-disconnections have risen considerably over the last wee while, and you guys will know that for your constituency stuff, that people just simply, make choice about heating their house or feeding their wens, and that's how dire things are for some people. But energy companies physically disconnecting people is almost a thing of the past now, and a large part of that is going to be the issue.
If I can interrupt,
yeah?
you've indicated that you think the funding is going to go away in terms of the advocacy side, or potentially. You must have already scoped out what the impact would be, how much funding you would potentially have at risk there.
Yeah,
do you have those figures?
Well, I suppose for me, we are not saying that the advocacy function on energy, for example, that the levy-based advocacy money is going, but we won't be, walking away from engaging and advocating on behalf of consumers and vulnerable consumers in the energy market. The energy market, as you know, there's going to be a rise in energy bills moving forward. There's climate change targets to meet. There's carbon reductions. There's a whole range of things that are happening in the energy market and now in the foreseeable future around networks and everything else. And we need to be a central part of that, speaking for the people that don't really have a voice, because there's a lot of issues. So electric cars, how things move forward. The vast majority of the people that come into our bureaus and come to us will never have an electric car. So why should they pay for the privilege of the infrastructure cost to do that? There's big decisions and discussions that I'm sure you guys will be having about whether government pays for that, the industry pays for it, whatever. So we need to continue to have a role in that space, and I think the Minister agrees that we should have that.
But you haven't actually scoped out what part of that work might be at risk in terms of moving to the new body or whatever, because you did say earlier on that you felt some of it might move away. You must have assessed that.
I mean, yes, but there's the levy-funded advocacy, I think, that you're having a note of that equates to roughly £1.5 million.
And that's the part you think it could potentially be at risk?
Well, that's the part that, I think for us, we have, where we've got to with government is an understanding of the advocacy that we provide is crucial moving forward. So we have taken a bit of a hit, but it's a manageable hit in terms of the amount of resource that we will have to provide advocacy moving forward.
Okay, maybe I can move on to something a little bit different. In your response and letter to the committee, you said you would like to see the role of Citizens Advice Scotland put on a statutory basis in the Consumer Scotland Bill. 2 questions on that. How would that work in practice, and what difference would it actually make?
Up until advocacy and advice was devolved, we previously were in statute in the SEER Act. We were named as being advocates. This comes back to what Rory said earlier about we are absolutely supportive of what could be a unique public body working in Scotland and providing first-class services for that top-down approach and our bottom-up approach. The fear is not now, it's what happens in the future for us. And we want some recognition the work that we will continue to do, just as we've spoken about now, into the future. So, for example, in the bill, it talks about, you know, I think you see in some of the responses, a lot of the responses that come in about this fear of replication and duplication. There's, you know, there's a part of the bill that talks about not replicating or duplicating what public authorities do. I'm not sure why it's defined to as specific as public authorities. In Scotland, there isn't a, you know, we've not got infinite resources to provide advocacy. No government's got infinite resources either. So our focus is on making sure that any new kid in the block, any new body, comes in and adds value and doesn't do things that have already been done. So, you know, there is precedent for it, and we've, you know, because we are, you know, got over 2,500 volunteers, as Jane said earlier, doesn't mean say we can't carry out statutory functions.
Just to clarify one point in my mind, do you have a different status here in Scotland from in England? In other words, do you have some sort of statutory basis down in England that you don't have up here?
Our sister organisation does.
It does. What would that be?
So under the SEER Act, previously, before it was amended under the Scotland Act, we did have the statutory responsibility. That has now been removed from Citizens Advice Scotland, but is still held by Citizens Advice England and Wales. So I suppose our
And the Consumer Council.
ask of the committee is that that position be put back into legislation in Scotland so that we can continue to have assurance that we will be delivering that people-based advocacy on behalf of citizens across Scotland.
But again, to be clear, it's not affecting your day-to-day services in Scotland. It's more securing your position in the future that you're concerned about.
I think it's about making sure that we can continue to deliver that service, yes.
I want to bring Rory Merrin, who I think was wanting to comment. Perhaps also you could clarify which specific act we're talking about here. I think an acronym or something was used for it.
Okay. They'll do that.
Yeah.
Can I take the first point? I think I've been chair of CAS for 3 years. 18 months ago, we were told that £1.5 million would be taken off us to form the basis of the funding of the new agency. And it's taken 18 months of our time to try and get an assurance from the Minister that that will now not happen. Right? Now, what I'm looking for is a situation where the biggest provider of consumer advice and advocacy in Scotland is not spending 18 months of its time trying to ensure that its resources continue and its ability to support citizens continues, because there's no protection for us in any legislation or in any other assurance that means we can be sure going into the future that the resources we've got now are the resources we've got going forward. So it is a real issue for the network to be able to plan for the future, not thinking that at a stroke, with no reference to anything else, we can just be told to form this new thing, £1.5 million has got to come off. A third of our available resources has got to disappear in order to form the agency. Now, it hasn't happened because we spent 18 months seeking reassurance with ministers. But should the board of CAS be spending 18 months trying to ensure we don't lose resources, or should we be focusing on the needs of citizens and providing the best possible service? So yes, we are looking for some statutory basis that says you can't simply come along and take your resources away and say it's been transferred to another agency. That doesn't seem to me to be very unreasonable for the biggest provider of consumer advice and advocacy in Scotland.
Statutory basis that you're looking for is really about ring-fencing funding.
No, the statutory basis I'm looking for is that policymakers have to treat us as seriously as other people. And that isn't what necessarily happens just now. And being named in the bill would allow us to have that status. That's what we're after for. We know you can't take away all our uncertainties. We know you can't secure us funding into the future. All we're asking for is that we don't add to those uncertainties and insecurities by the fact that we were in statute before and we're now not going to be. That seems to us to be a regressive step, and we're not wanting that to happen. But Derek will talk about what the acronym actually means.
Says Rory confidently.
I was looking through it. I think it's the Consumer Estate Agents Redress Act 2007.
So that's a UK Act which applied only to England because, of course, in Scotland it's devolved. Is that correct?
It's devolved now, so it was the powers that we had under that Act were changed under the Scotland Act.
Right, more recently than the 2007 UK Act.
Yes.
So the bill that we are considering is effectively a reconsideration of where we're at in Scotland, since it's now the preserve of the Scottish Parliament to deal with it.
Yes.
Essentially what we're looking for moving forward is an assurance that our place in that space that we've occupied for 80 years continues into the future. And I think in our recent conversations, I think when we had this difficulty with funding, and once we'd spoken to the Minister, I think things happened pretty quickly, because I don't think it was the Minister's intention. And I think he's given an assurance that he respects, trusts and values what we do moving forward. We're wanting some sort of assurance moving forward. Now, if that's in the bill, it would be great. If that could be through guidance or whatever it would be. But we don't want to be faced with the same situation into the future that we've been facing the last 18 months with a huge degree of uncertainty, because what we want to do is represent people. That's what we're good at.
Right, we'll move on to questions from Richard Lyle.
I believe actually you've near enough answered the question I'm going to ask you, and having previously worked with Mr Mayor, morning Rory again, haven't seen him for a number of years in another setting, I know how much he likes to press government and other things. But basically, what do you really want out of this bill? What is your view? I respect your organisation and what you do, and I actually have one in my round the corner from my office. Basically, a Citizen Advice Bureau. So, what would you suggest? Should the detail be in the Consumer Scotland Bill? And what do you suggest that Consumer Scotland will do in practice? And what is needed? And what would you like to... What guarantees would you like, if any?
I'll start, but others will no doubt come in. I think we think there's a big prize on offer here. So with the advent of Consumer Scotland, we think that you get this strategic top-down approach to consumer issues, big research, big campaigns, and that meets the bottom-up approach. And we think that provides something absolutely unique to Scotland. That would be a fantastic consumer protection and advice service. Our worry is that in the creation of this top-down bit, you eat into the bottom-up bit. So what we're looking for is to make sure that in creating the new agency, it doesn't undermine what's already there, because citizens rely on that. And it's not just that citizens rely on that, but it also gets this balance between a bottom-up approach to consumer issues and a top-down approach. And if we can merge those together properly, we genuinely believe as a Board of CAS that would be a good thing, which is why we support the creation of Consumer Scotland. What we're wanting is a reassurance that it will concentrate on the things it said it would do. And we would like some detail on what's a systems-based approach to consumer issues. It says that's what this is going to be. We've not heard a description of what that is, and we think you ought to press. I know what I think that is, and I know what would be valuable. So just like, as you'll remember from our days in local government, we moved away from an audit position, which was you got audited once in a blue moon, to best value. We think there should be a best value type of process for consumers. So you'd be saying to providers of service, if you don't have the systems in place to protect and nurture consumers, we'll assume you're not doing it. That's what a systems-based approach would be. We will never be doing that. But if you combine that with what we do, you get a fantastic consumer protection and advice service in Scotland. So that's what we would like.
So basically you want this new organisation to have what it's going to do set in stone. Bear with me, Rod. And basically, or alternatively, that you know what it's going to do and what it's going to do in the future and what you're going to be, because you want to be left to do what you're good at and also carry on with the good work that you're doing. So basically, you want assurances or basically a commitment from in this act, in this bill, to ensure that you can carry on in the setting, that nothing changes. Things will improve for consumers, period, but basically your organisation won't be over-affected by this bill, which I think is near enough what I'm getting from you.
I don't think we feel that nothing will change. I think you can't bring an agency like this into being and nothing will change. I think what we want is that in the bringing in of this new agency, that's not seen as an end in itself. What the outcome we want here is the creation of a better system. So all we're asking is that in the creation of the new agency, it's got to take into account the effect it will have on people who are already doing business. I think over years, once Consumer Scotland is established, I think our business will change, and certainly the interface between us and them will have to develop. So the idea that we are simply saying, no, we want nothing to change, I don't think that's fair. But yes, we do want assurances that citizens will continue to be served by us in the way they have been in the past.
I see Jane Adams want to come in.
Yeah, I just want to follow on from that. When we consulted with chief officers over this bill, we were concerned by the lack of detail. You know, we weren't exactly sure what Consumer Scotland would be doing, so it was hard to base an opinion on that. But certainly the consensus was that we didn't see any value in Consumer Scotland replicating what CABS and CAS are already doing. Not just already doing, but doing very, very well and have done for 80 years. Of course, we welcome any developments that would make the consumer landscape fairer in Scotland, but we want the community-based advocacy that we do to be recognised and protected. But, you know, from the Chief Officer's point of view, the bill didn't have that detail as to what it would actually be doing, but we would want to see kind of what we're doing protected but do see value in work being done at a more macro level, like Rory said.
I'll finish by again pressing you. Any one of you can answer this question. What do you think Consumer Scotland should do? And what do you think you should be left to do?
For me, Consumer Scotland should do the things that we've been discussing with officials and
like what?
Ministers. High-level investigations into consumer detriment, taking a systems-based approach to how systems and markets operate, ensuring that there's a consumer duty. It was our proposal, it was our ask for that to be in place, to make sure that consumers get the rights that, you know, in terms of Fairer Scotland duty, the Equalities duty does, to make sure that, as Rory says, in terms of that almost best value approach, that if people can't demonstrate that they're doing that, you assume they're not. These are the types of high-level things that Consumer Scotland can do and will do very, very well. For us, it's not that we don't want to change. I mean, you know, I think we're in our 80th anniversary, and it does, you know, at times you look back quite a bit. And, you know, when we were first formed, you know, in 1939, we dealt with ration books and evacuations and folk getting their houses bombed. So we've moved on. And then, you know, I think some of the stuff that people have talked about today, and there's still this sense that we simply deal with citizen issues and benefits and debt and housing. But if we want to remain as relevant today and into the future as we've been in the past, then we will change. We've changed enormously in the last 2 to 3 years, and we'll continue to change. So we will change and evolve, but we'll change and evolve in a way that makes sense for the people that we often represent.
So basically what you're saying today is leave us to do what we do well, and basically Consumer Scotland, you can set the policy.
I mean, it's not just us that's in that consumer landscape at the moment. There's many in that consumer landscape that do very, very good work. What we're looking to this new body to do, and I think what the intention of the new body to do will be provide additionality to that around the things that I spoke about earlier.
Thank you.
Thanks.
If I could just clarify what I understood Rory Mayer to be saying, and I'm assuming, Derek Mitchell, you haven't been advising for the past 80 years.
No, myself, no.
It's not, as I understand it, that you want things set in stone, but you want to know what the framework is within which you'll operate. Is that correct to understand that?
Yes, and that just as we have to be respectful and cognizant of the new body has to be respectful and cognizant of the people that are already in the business doing the work. So we're looking for that kind of reassurance. I think we will have to negotiate this. You can't set in stone, and we wouldn't ask you to, what this agency will do on day one in a pinned down way. That would just restrict the agency. But a framework, as you say, that says how we will operate together seems to us to be very important.
And further on that point, I mean, I think Mr. Lyle's asking, well, what is the detail of what you see that as being? And Derek Mitchell's response is that's been put to ministers in discussions. I'm just wondering if, in response to Mr. Lyle's question, you could give us in writing to the committee after today's hearing what precisely that is that you're looking for in terms of the framework, and that might be helpful to have that. And perhaps finally, and then I'll come to a question from Jamie Halcrow-Johnston. The bill creates, or is intended to create, a duty on certain public bodies to have regard to the impact of their strategic decisions on consumers. Is that something you favour? And is that something that's set out specifically enough as it is in the bill at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intention is absolutely right. How it works in practice, we will need to wait and see. You know, it's certainly for us, I think others have said today about the amount of information that we glean for communities every day, and we are absolutely keen through the development of Data Hub and that information that we've got to tell that lived experience to Consumer Scotland and policymakers generally. How they get that from public authorities is another matter, but I think the intention's absolutely right.
All right. And on that, as in on any point that's been raised, you can write into the committee later to clarify or add to what you've said here. Jamie Halcrow-Johnston, and then we'll come to the Deputy Convener for questions.
Thanks very much. Congratulations on your 8 years as well. There's two kind of areas very briefly. If I can maybe ask either Rory Mayer or Derek Mitchell, prior to the announcement that, or the concerns that you had that you were going to lose 1.5 million, what consultation did you have with government on that? What was this something that was sprung on you, or had you been discussing with them potential for a change in funding and the like?
I wouldn't say that there was consultation. It came pretty much out of the blue.
Okay. A lovely surprise for you.
It was.
And the funding that you've had, as you say, roughly 1.5 million, how long has that been kind of part of your revenues, and also how long is it guaranteed for the future, this reassurances that you've had?
Well, the funding that we had around what we're going to lose has been there since 2012, since Consumer Focus was disbanded, the powers in Scotland came to us.
And kind of how long a guarantee has it?
I think the
1 year or 3 years?
Yeah, the commitment we've got at the moment is for the next financial year, right. But our assumption in discussions is that becomes part of our base budget, so would then, like anyone else, but you would require to cut that from there. And I think the intention, I don't think it's to do that, but it's still. That's life in the third sector, I suppose. Okay. You know, it gives us some clarity over the next 18 months.
But there's not a long-term commitment for that at the moment?
I think that part of what we would be seeking assurances through this process for the.
Okay, thanks for that. I was just going to come back to this idea of the potential role of Consumer Scotland and how it fits in. Obviously, at the moment, when you are doing perhaps the high-level research and campaigns, you can utilise the information that comes in from the bureaus and that data to make your kind of cases and to do your research. How would that data be available to the new body? If it's your data at the moment, would it be made available, or would data restrictions prevent you from doing that?
We won't give personal data, but anonymised data, yes, we're committed to. You know, for me, the future for this consumer protection system in Scotland should be about collaboration and partnership. So we will do whatever we can to help the new body in future.
So that would be available to them.
Absolutely.
And just going again, I mean, we've talked about this, as I say, this high-level research. It's obviously there are areas where you do that. There are areas where other organisations do that at the moment. Is there any reason why this new body could do that better than you do, or other organisations do it at the moment, if that additional funding that's being allocated to set up the new body was provided to fund you to do the research, or as I say, other organisations?
I mean, I think I think we were on record as saying that, you know, that we could, I think we do, the research we carry out we do very well, and we approach it in the right manner, and it quite often validates that lived experience. But I'm sure Consumer Scotland will do it well as well.
Because obviously there are areas that perhaps you specialise more, there are areas where other consumer bodies specialise in more, whereas the new body will be more general. So
I think that even if our vision of Consumer Scotland were to be the one that was brought forward, aiming at the things that we've described, I think you're at pointing where the interface will be most immediate. What's top level advice for us, and what's research for us, and what's research for the new agency? I think we'll have to work that through quite carefully. And as Derek was suggesting, if there is an area where staff transfer might occur, I think it's in that area of high level research.
Okay. All right. Just to kind of quote you from your own submission, the bill as presented is too greatly focused on the single output of creating Consumer Scotland, and too little is said about how this action creates a better outcome for citizens in terms of an enhanced system to better protect their interest. So, you know, as a general point, where can you see this creating better protection for consumers? And if we had a clean slate again, would this be the way that you would try and improve protection, or would there be another approach?
I mean, I think genuinely, and this has been what's been difficult for us as a board, is that we do see value in Consumer Scotland, but we do see it as a threat to us as well. So it's been difficult for us because on behalf of consumers, we want to welcome what Consumer Scotland could be. At a practical level, we're worried about resources and whether it'll impinge on our work, which is why we're coming here saying, actually, we think there are things that we don't do and we shouldn't do. We don't know how to make markets more consumer friendly. We don't know, and we don't have the backing of a government-led agency to do very high-level investigations and get redress at that level. That's not what we specialise in. We specialise in a community-based lived experience approach. So we do recognise that the new agency would do some good stuff. Our concern is it only does good stuff if it recognises the rest of the system has to be maintained as well. If it thinks that creating the new thing at the expense of the rest of the system, that will not be good for consumers. So we need to keep the whole system in place and augment it with the new thing that we're talking about.
And do you think there is a willingness from the government, from the Minister, to address the concerns you have, and I'm sure others within the sector have?
That's what we carry on pressing the Minister about.
Okay, thank you.
Very briefly, Gordon MacDonald and then Wally Coffey.
I'm just looking for a point of clarification. This 1.5 million has came up a couple of times this morning in conversation, and you've said you have a reassurance over funding. If that 1.5 million relates to high-level research staff, that could possibly transfer over to a new organisation, surely the net effect on the organisation is zero. Or are you saying that use some of that funding to cross-subsidise other parts of your organisation?
Well, if only we had £1.5 million for high-level research, that would have been great. But in fact, only a couple of 100,000 of that was high-level research. The rest ate right into the core of what we do. So what's actually happened is there was a suggestion about 1.5 million. We've been assured that we won't lose substantial resources. The bit that I think is perhaps a wee bit lower is a recognition that some of that high-level research will go to the new agency. So, but believe me, the 1.5 million was not high-level research. It ate completely into the core of what we did, which is why we were so keen to get the assurance that we wouldn't lose that money. It would really have made our lives virtually impossible in terms of consumer advocacy and to support the CABs to do that advocacy as well. So it wasn't just a transfer based on the high-level research. That amounts to a much smaller figure than that.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. Rory, you've almost answered the question I was going to ask. I wanted to pick out a little bit more on this separation of duty conversation that we've been having for a wee moment or two, and your submission did talk about the bottom-up approach taken by CASCB and the potential top-down approach by Consumer Scotland and how that might work. And then just a wee moment ago you were saying we don't do certain things and we don't carry out certain functions. Could you just flesh that out a wee bit more for me, please, so that we could maybe get a clearer understanding of what the separation of duty might actually look like in practice?
I can, and if you don't mind, others will come in probably with more specifics than me, but as far as I recognise it, we are, as I say, bottom up. So there's an amount of advocacy we do. But if you said to us, it's our job to intervene in markets across the board, not on the basis of consumers coming to us with questions, but just to try and find a systematic way of making providers of service and goods be more nurturing of consumers and less exploitative. That's not our job. That's not what Citizens Advice was set up to do, and it's not what we'd want to do. Similarly, doing massive research about into the future, where is potential consumer detriment and how do we avoid it, that's quite difficult for us to do. It's, well, you know, so I think that, and similarly, I also think if there are big investigations, the fact that it's a government-led agency that does those investigations and can then seek redress is a very different thing than us doing it from a bottom-up point on behalf of consumers. It's not we won't do bits of that, but I do think there is a place for that activity, which is exactly the things that in the consultation document the government laid out that Consumer Scotland would do, which is what we support. But others may want to say more detail than that.
No, I think that's right. And, you know, I think the sense that I have is that this new body will have economists and analysts doing that systems-based approach. We don't have any economists and analysts at that level. So this is about additionality. We've got a well-defined space. As I said earlier, there's a lot of people provide very, very good consumer protection in Scotland, and we see this adding value to that landscape. But we don't want to see it replicating or duplicating that landscape as well.
Mm-hmm. So if that turns out to be the defined relationship, then that would be something that you would be supportive of and able to work within. Thank you for that. I wanted to ask about data sharing as well as an issue. And Anne, you mentioned that you've got one of the biggest data sets in public consumer issues probably of anyone really.
Yes.
So if when the new agency is set up, it's clearly going to depend on gathering data from yourselves and a number of other sources. How do we see that working, you sharing data across similar organisations or to Consumer Scotland? Is that going to work quite well, do you think?
I mean, I think we recognise that data sharing will be crucial to the new agency. Obviously, as an organisation that has a footprint across most communities in Scotland, that is the source of the data that we get, that lived experience. And as a central agency, will need to have access to that type of information in order to do the advocacy work that they will want to do, as well as information from other agencies. We, as the Chief Executive had said, we welcome the opportunity that this new body can create to enhance that data sharing, to make sure that all the data sets that exist across Scotland can be pulled together to identify those significant issues that cause consumer detriment. So provided that it is consistent with all the GDPR legislation and that it doesn't impact on our confidentiality, our impartiality or our services to citizens, we would be happy to share that data. I think what we would like to see is perhaps a bit of scoping work done initially to see what data is out there that can support the new agency, and to understand, as you say, how easy it will be for that data to be shared with the new agency, because that is going to be fundamental to its ability to be able to do its job. And I suppose one of the asks for us as well is actually that data set that the new agency develops be made public. So we think that could be a really useful data set for all agencies, and to be used as an education tool and a means of improving outcomes for consumers.
Presumably we'll need to talk about, discuss and agree who has access to and ownership of your data set. And so
absolutely.
That's bound to be a consideration that has
absolutely, and that's something that we would want to discuss with our network. But I think, we wouldn't be wanting to put unnecessary barriers in place. Our aim is to make things better for citizens and consumers, for people to improve things. We think we have a key role in doing that. We use our data to make sure that we can campaign on those issues that impact on people and communities, and we're happy for other agencies to work with them where appropriate to make sure that if there are other ways that consumer detriment can be tackled, that we are party to being able to do that.
Okay, thank you for that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming in to all of our guests, and I'll now suspend the meeting to move over to the next panel of witnesses. Thank you. Well, welcome back to our second panel of witnesses on the Consumer Scotland Bill. And with us now we have, from my right to left, first of all, Adam Sahura, who is the Head of Policy and Communications for Age Scotland, Gillian Bergen, who is Social Policy Worker and Scams Helpline Advisor with Clackmannanshire Citizens Advice Bureau, Lucy O'Leary, who's the Chair of Central Borders Citizens Advice Bureau, and Christy Kelly, Bureau Manager for Aberdeen Citizens Advice Bureau. So welcome to all four of you. And I'll turn first of all to Gordon MacDonald for questions.
Thank you very much, Convener. The Audit Scotland report that came out a few years ago highlighted that 1.3 million people in Scotland think they have reason to complain about the quality of products or services, and that over 500,000 either do not complain to the retailer or take no further action. And I'm just curious about, in your own specific areas, what is the major consumer issues that are brought to you?
I'll start with something that some of the bigger ones that we'll deal with through our helpline, Age Scotland's free national helpline, will actually be around care home contracts. Number one, there could be issues with regard to funerals and the kind of provision of services around about that. But there was a very interesting bit of work we've done with COSLA, Trading Standards, and after the CMA investigation into care home contracts, trying to develop better information and advice for people in terms of when they initiate contracts and what to kind of expect of it. So for us, that's a kind of a big one, but notwithstanding the kind of the more routine things that might kind of happen, the people kind of, whatever the products or services they're buying, and actually finding that, for instance, digital exclusion will make it more difficult for people to understand how to access their rights, what to do about it, how to contact that company, or trying to find any kind of trace of their purchase. They might have misplaced a receipt, for instance, or whatever, but there's that's a big thing for us.
Okay. Anybody else?
Within Clark Manager, the consumer stats that we have normally make up about just short of 22% of our client base. But breaking that down further, 14% are actually debt issues, which arise from arrears and hire purchase, catalogue and mail order, and even mortgage or bank and building society overdrafts as well. But especially, well, significantly more so recently is also car finance and repair as well.
Of our, as the previous witnesses explained, sometimes, you know, things may be logged as several different issues, but the ones that are identified as consumer issues for us in Galashiels, about half of them are around utilities and communications. It's the big ticket items, and and it may well be that those smaller items are dealt with online or through the website.
Okay.
I would agree with that as well, that a lot of our consumer issues is around debt and, again, utilities.
Okay. In evidence last week, we heard from, I think it was Thomas Docherty of Which, that said that there is no consumer body that's currently advocating on behalf of banking services in Scotland, legal services, rail, and you did mention communications, but he mentioned telecommunications is not being touched upon. Is there any reason why you think no organisation is actually looking at this on behalf of consumers in Scotland?
I think there'll be lots of organisations that will look at that individually. I know, for instance, whether it's Advice Scotland or East Scotland or Which or whoever, all conduct inquiries and investigations into issues that they're faced. But I think if you look at banks, for instance, you know, just personal views that, you know, they are regulated on a UK-wide basis, and the basis of that is sort of a reserved sort of power. And I think whether or not, I know this committee and others have looked at the impact of bank branch closures, for instance, and how they particularly impact consumers in Scotland. I think the challenge might have been that you know, where that kind of responsibility might lie, and or where the kind of the boardrooms are of these different banks and how interest. But I think it's certainly incumbent upon lots of different organisations to flag up these issues that you raise, highlight them, and for members of this committee and beyond this room to kind of advocate on behalf of their constituents too. I think there are probably quite set regulatory bodies, whether it's Ofcom, Ofgem, you know, and such like for that already, that they've got teeth, perhaps.
Yeah. I can't answer the question about why there aren't regulatory bodies. All I would want to say is that if you look, for example, at utilities and communications, the change in the market structure and the change in, you know, the bodies that people will be having issues with is so rapid. I'm not quite sure how you can kind of chase a moving target. But think about communications. It's gone from people complaining about BT not putting a line into their house to their mobile phone contract, and, you know, what's happening around that, and actually how, and the same for utilities, you know, the explosion in companies, you know, the range of companies offering services over the years. It's, you know, it's very fast moving in all of those, even though the issues stay the same. The complainees, if you like, change very quickly.
I think what I'm trying to get at is, do you think there is a need for a general organisation that will look at the wider consumer issues that can support you guys in carrying out your day-to-day advice work? If there was somebody looking at, here are the problems, here's how we could address them, here are the signposting for your you know, clients in order to get the best advice, or to look at regulation for governments, whether it's the Scottish Government or UK Government?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, as a bureau, we can only take things to a certain level, whether it be first or second tier advice. But it's the third tier and above that, as a bureau, that we need support with. I mean, when I was reading some of the feedback that we had, somebody mentioned a phrase which I thought was absolutely brilliant, which was called a super complaint. And I feel that, you know, there are such things as super complaints. As a bureau, we deal with so many different organisations, and they have so many different rules, and they're governed by different bodies, that, you know, if we had a body that we could go to say, look, we can take, you know, we've only taken this as far as we can take it, we need support, and it's the higher, it's to enhance what we already do, is what I feel within a bureau that we would welcome.
Okay.
And I think this goes to the heart of the relationship between the Bureau, CAS and Consumer Scotland, in that we're seeing clients coming through the door. They're not saying, I've got a consumer issue, they're just asking for help. We and our advisors may identify which bits of those are consumer issues. That takes a lot of teasing out in some cases. Being able to aggregate that within CAS so that we can say, look, there's a widespread problem, it's particularly big in rural areas, whatever it happens to be, that's a really valuable function. But then having something, as previously said, that can really tackle the infrastructure bit and the shape of the market would be, that's the extra bit of the jigsaw, I think, that would be good.
The suggestion is that when this body is created, they can probably look at 2 or 3 subjects maximum in any 1 year, certainly at the beginning. What areas would you suggest should be a priority for them to look at on behalf of clients?
I mean, I run the scams web chat, and I think scams is a massive problem. I mean, we've been running it since the 2nd of September. I mean, I've dealt with 36 cases already, and it's actually so far totaling about £33,000 in money that's lost to scams. I think that is a massive area that should be focused on.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'd like to see the beginning part of that work actually taking a really good whole systems look at where consumer harms fit into the other bits of, you know, employment debt, you know, welfare. I'm not sure I could identify an issue, because I think the danger of that is it hives it off into a little world of its own again, and that's not how it is for our clients.
Okay.
I would agree with that also, that you probably want to have a look at, like you've identified a few gaps possibly there, that you look at a wider picture of everything and then identify what gaps there are and maybe focus on them.
Okay, thanks so much.
Right, Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Do you think the public are genuinely confused about who to go to for help and so on, and do they need clarity about who best to approach, and could Consumer Scotland help to kind of declutter that kind of landscape, do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, I spent 22 years in retail, and I always remember that as a deputy store manager, if I couldn't resolve their complaint, the first thing they would say was, I'm going to Citizen Advice to make a complaint, you know, I'm going to take this further. So I do think that Citizen Advice is a body that people recognise to go to for help, for us to then escalate it on their behalf.
I think there's an absolute place for lots of different organisations that can advocate and give good advice, because I think this really depends on who the audience is, who they like. It'll be the same in sort of politics at the same point, isn't it? Kind of voters, whoever constituents go to, who they trust, who they like, who they've got a good relationship with. I think there is certainly a useful place for this agency to be kind of overarching and kind of this, you know, where the kind of the first point of call for lots of things that can signpost away. Because if you look at what the landscape is, you've got the CMA that will look at investigations, but they don't really have all the teeth. They'll give recommendations. You've got trading standards people will think of to go to as well, beyond the sort of CAB network and Citizen Advice Scotland or Age Scotland or whoever, but they kind of really go to businesses to kind of speak to them, as opposed to necessarily the consumer facing. They sort of take the consumer problem to the business. so I think there's certainly a really good place for this as an overarching kind of point that anyone could think of. Consumer Scotland is a quite straightforward agency in name. This is where I'm going to go to find out all of these problems and issues.
And Christy Kelly.
My comment is around the name being called Consumer Scotland could be really confusing to people that would already know where to go for help. I mean, it doesn't really sort of say what you do. The people could phone you up. And the other thing, I mean, it was mentioned earlier in the previous panel that you phone one and actually know you're told you need to go somewhere else. Are you going to be another layer to that, that they phone you and you say, well, phone this person, and they say, no, actually, it's this person. You know what I mean? You need to have that really clearly defined as to who you're passing people on to, so they're not just passed around and then they get fed up and give up and don't bother resolving their issue because they can't even figure out who they're supposed to speak to about it.
Okay, thank you for that. I wonder if I could ask a second question, please, if I can. Adam, you talked about digital by default in your submission and so on, and is there a risk that a lot of the advice is becoming too digital and that's the only option for many people? And yeah, I think you also talked about premium advice lines and so on, so you can only get advice if you're able to afford to pay to make these phone calls and so on. Is there a risk that we're making it a bit too digital?
Digital becomes the kind of most straightforward and simple option for lots of things. You know, it's the fastest way to kind of put up information and to direct people, because huge numbers of people will, in your pockets right now, have mobile phones and be able to kind of Google something or use whatever search engine you choose. The big challenge, as we see Age Scotland, is let's look at older people in general, and we're looking at anyone over the age of 50, but there are 500,000 people in Scotland over the age of 60 who do not use the internet. We use this repeatedly, and that's kind of current figures. That's the population of Edinburgh who do not use the internet, that might not have anyone else to kind of go to ask them for advice. Where do I find out about this or whatever? So the danger is those people who might be the most vulnerable, the most kind of in need, don't even know in the first place how to get access to the phone number to phone up, because it'll be on a website. And we were sort of having a little bit look around in terms of different types of advice you can get or where to be signposted, and the kind of the answer is, and it's actually the same for lots of local authorities, is to find a phone number. First of all, you have to go online to find it if you're lucky enough to be able to navigate this sort of maze in the first instance. So for us, the big challenge is having different options for people to go to, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's on the phone, and a free phone number is absolutely vital, and making sure that there aren't things like kind of lots of different number options for people to dial and work out, you know, do you want to see this person? By the time you've run through 6 options, you've forgotten what the first one is. And also having kind of a way you can kind of write into people. But I think for us, the free phone and the face-to-face is hugely important, just because a lot of older people may have physical things they want to talk through with somebody, but then they might not have the facility to kind of take a photo of the thing or scan it in and email it off somewhere. But I think when you look at it in the context, 500,000 people at the age of 60 not using the internet, that's a significant number of people that could just miss out.
Yep. Lucy?
So yeah, just as a very concrete example, we all the Bureau collect information from individual clients, feed that up to CAS to inform their policy development. So I'm looking at our social policy report from the last quarter, and 82-year-old guy doesn't have internet access, trying to get him to find a cheaper energy deal. All the cheap energy deals are online only. So immediately you've turned a consumer issue into a money issue, into a fuel poverty issue.
Christy, did you want to?
I just want to say that, you know, digital is something that should add to what's already there. Like, we as a network are moving to more digital options. We now do, you know, web chats and more telephone support than we did before, and we're looking to move that. But I would say that doesn't at all detract from the number of people that come through our doors looking for face-to-face. That's increased the number of people we've dealt with, not in any way affected our face-to-face support. So it's important that you have both options for people.
So if there's to be a role for anyone in this area, perhaps Consumer Scotland, it should be to ensure that we don't actually make the gaps, the digital gaps, wider by anything that we do. We should try to reach out to particular sections of society that are more vulnerable and don't have access. So I presume you're going to agree we need to give further consideration to this to get it right.
I'd just like to make a point about vulnerability, and I know in the Act there's a particular description of vulnerability, and all our clients are vulnerable at the moment they come into us, whether or not they tick an official vulnerability. But I mean, I'm vulnerable if I'm trying to sort out you know, some really knotty problem. I'm vulnerable to misinformation and duff advice and all that sort of thing. So absolutely, the people that we see are vulnerable because they have a problem, not just because they hit a description of somebody who's vulnerable.
Okay, thank you for that.
Jackie Bailey.
Can I go to Lucy O'Leary's point first? Because obviously there's an offer of a definition of vulnerability in the bill. I take it from you would want that widened, so that there's a more flexible definition? Yeah,
I certainly would. I mean, there are some big gaps. For example, the rising proportion of people that our Bureau sees with mental health issues, either temporary or long-term. I think that the word that I tend to use when we're talking in the Bureau about who we help, it's people who are at a low point of resilience. Okay. And that can be me because I'm having a bad day. It can be somebody who's got a long-standing mental health problem. It can be somebody who lives 10 miles from the nearest bus. You know, it's not a badge. It's just a state of
being. Is that a view that's shared by your colleagues on the panel? Mm-hmm. I'm getting the nods. Absolutely. Okay.
I agree with that. I think there's certainly, I mean, we look at older people, not all older people are vulnerable. We would never say that Age Scotland. There is, when we look in the context of scams and fraud, we might discuss the perceived vulnerability as a kind of a target market of people, because for lots of reasons, whether they live on their own, whether they've got cognitive impairment, you know, for lots of different reasons that they might be. Do welcome the fact that older people are put into this, and that's maybe more like their perceived vulnerability. But it's a very good point about as soon as someone presents themselves with a problem, that they are, in a sense, needing that kind of help. And
okay, sticking with definitions for a minute, because the bill defines consumers in a way that excludes small businesses, and I'm thinking of the sole trader kind of operation. Do you think that's helpful, or do you think they should be included? Because I'm conscious other pieces of consumer legislation include them. Anybody got a view?
From our perspective, again, we're in Galashiels, so if you know what it's like, you know, we've got small business, sort of urban environment with a rural hinterland with a load of rural, very small businesses in there, and I think absolutely the vulnerability, if you like, of those businesses to disruptions in communications, you know, the broadband is, I won't get into that, but anyway, you know, your vulnerability to actually any kind of disruption in that and your ability to get something done about it is big for us.
Okay. And again, is that a view shared? You don't.
You on the sole trader from our line of work, I'm afraid.
Are there no older?
There will be, and there'll be incredibly valuable parts of the economy, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm best judged.
Nice recovery. Some of the submissions we received suggested that there were genuine concerns that Consumer Scotland might end up duplicating work carried out by other organisations. I'm keen to know how you would avoid that so we get the added value from this new body that's suggested. Maybe I'll start with Adam.
It's very interesting when you look at the landscape in terms of where there is information, advice, advocacy work. There is a really good network, I think, across Scotland for this, whether it's through the network of bureaus, whether it's through, let's say, the Age Scotland helpline, our information guides, our community development work, whether there's lots of other organisations who do very similar things. I think that it's important that some people might not, I said this earlier on, they might not be comfortable with one organisation, but they'll look to someone else in the first instance because they've had a good experience. What is very important, however, is every organisation that is providing information, advice, advocacy work actually kind of works together as well to realise that they might not just have this one monopoly. I know that, for instance, we do good partnership working with Citizens Advice Scotland on lots of consumer issues, advocacy issues, but actually knowing who the expert is. I do understand that there might be CABs or Citizens Advice Scotland people who will signpost or refer individuals who've got kind of issues in social care and care home contracts to Age Scotland, and that means they can have the right advice or what might be seen the best one. So I think it's important in that landscape to understand there might be people better suited to help those. So that would be really important in the round, especially if you're looking at kind of Consumer Scotland and how everyone works. It might not be the most helpful thing in order to have one person have a monopoly on everything. I don't think anybody would think that would be a good thing. But I think partly we've got a good landscape in Scotland for kind of cross work and realising where the best efforts can be placed or who the experts in some niche fields might be, but realising the end product will be whoever's come to you, presented yourself to you, in the same way as members here will have constituents presenting themselves, and your caseworkers will do valiant and noble work to make sure their problems are resolved. But you'll also, at the same point, know where to go if you don't know. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah. Any other views?
I agree with Adam. I mean, as I say, as a bureau, we can only take complaints so far, and to have that expert body, if you want, you know, made up of experts in the consumer field, would be welcome within bureaus, I think, because it's just like Adam said, you know, there's we do signpost people because we can only take things so far. But if you had one body that you could, so you're not having to put your client from pillar to post back and forward, back and forward.
But my understanding is they're not going to resolve individual client cases. They're there in a much more strategic advocacy role, and therefore your desire to have that kind of third tier won't rest with this body if it separates itself out. Christy Campbell.
I more see the role of Consumer Scotland being something where it collates all the information. So we've got the local people going, this person's have an issue, but so do you in your bureau, so do you in your bureau, you know what I mean? And CAST collate all that and feed it back. So, but as you know, Adam was saying as well, there's other bodies out there that collect different information, and I see the role being that you collate all that information and can make a higher level decision on it.
Okay, that's useful. Okay.
I also, in an ideal world, it would be great to have a body that was able to achieve a bit more consistency in terms of access to consumer advice. Because we're 60 different individually funded charities, we're all in different financial positions. Our budget's been cut year on year. So, like it or not, there is a bit of a postcode lottery currently in terms of your ability to talk to someone face-to-face in a bureau at the time that makes sense for you. I know it's difficult, but actually to have Consumer Scotland being able to do something around commissioning of good quality consumer advice at the right level would be absolutely fantastic.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Consumer Scotland will have advocacy, advice and information gathering powers. However, enforcement and powers to change the main consumer rights will remain reserved to the Westminster Government. Do you see that as a barrier to Consumer Scotland being able to really make a difference with consumers?
I suppose the proof will be in the pudding in terms of how it actually works and what the kind of issues are presented to it. I think one of the questions earlier on, what do you think the first kind of couple of years might look like? I don't really have an answer to that on the basis that things will change quite quickly. I think if you look at the other organisations or bodies that will then take things forward, whether it was the Competitions and Markets Authority, they're kind of, there's partnership in there. And I think as part of the kind of the change in legislation that there will be the view of Scottish ministers will certainly be taken into account in terms of any bigger work. I think there might be a challenge for Consumer Scotland to be able to talk about issues around the power of attorney. And what I mean by this is that the cross-border issues that exist, and it realising that where it might be able to advocate on behalf of people who have a power of attorney for someone else in consumer issues, but actually realising at the other end of it, whether it's in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, there might be a challenge for that to be accepted or adopted. But I'm not entirely sure yet if there would be a problem with where the sort of the main powers lie, entirely on the basis that I think Scottish ministers do have some power to help commission new work.
The whole bit about compelling information, it's a bit vague in the bill. It doesn't really say what that would mean. And you're saying now possibly that would be reserved to the Scottish Government to actually do the compelling. Is that right?
No. What I'm saying is that I'm concerned, and I'm looking to hear from yourselves what you feel about it. The enforcement and the powers to change consumer rights are still with the Westminster Government. So Consumer Scotland will have the powers of advocacy, advice, information gathering, and they have the powers to do that. But they don't have the powers to enforce any infringements or so on as they see it. They don't have the power to change any consumer legislation. All that's still with the Westminster government. So is that a barrier to Consumer Scotland in carrying out its duties effectively?
I guess it depends on your relationship with the Scottish Government once it's set up and formed then, because if they're going to set you up and you go doing all the hard work and all the evidence and then they don't actually listen to you and make any changes, then it's completely pointless.
Well, the point is that the Scottish Government doesn't have the power to make any changes. That's still reserved to Westminster.
Sorry, I misunderstood there, yeah.
So the question is, does that impair the ability of Consumer Scotland to do its job effectively?
I think it probably does, except that at the very least it's a slightly louder voice because it's one voice rather than what we've currently got, which is a whole lot of quieter voices.
But there doesn't seem to be an opinion as to whether Consumer Scotland would be more effective with enforcement powers.
What Consumer Scotland's actually going to be, then it's easier to have that opinion. And I'm not sure that I have that picture yet.
Okay. So it's envisaged that Consumer Scotland will collect data from lots of different sources to help it understand and prioritise consumer issues. What data would your organisations share with Consumer Scotland?
Generally share our information via the Citizens Advice Scotland, because we collate probably statistics. We have lots of detail in our cases which we wouldn't be able to share without the client's permission unless it was anonymised, but even anonymised you have to make sure it doesn't in any way identify people. But
are you saying that GDPR would restrict the information that
yeah,
you could share?
Yes.
How do you get past that?
I suppose it depends on what information is required, because under GDPR there'll be kind of lots of personal information that might not be necessary for Consumer Scotland. You know, it might be on the basis of, you know, an actual individual. But I think in terms of what we might potentially, depending on how things work out, in terms of offering insights, might be kind of general trends on types of issues that come in, calls, kind of locations, things which wouldn't necessarily be governed by, you know, someone's personal data. So I don't think there would really be a problem. But I think if they're a kind of an agency, they might be getting that information from other kind of public bodies, which they can do so. But from charities, they might want to feed into their work. I think, generally speaking, it's types of issues, trends, and volume to give them a picture of what's going on. In the same way as I don't think that anyone else would share individual information with ourselves unless we had express consent from that person.
Certainly, I'm taking from what I've seen that personal information would not be drilled down to that level. Therefore, as you say, it's going to be about trends and overall positions. So what information can you actually share that would be useful to Consumer Scotland?
I think that would be it. I think in terms of for us, if they're looking to conduct investigations or to raise an issue, we'd be able to express across, let's say, calls to our helpline on different types of issues. In a general sense, is there have been X number of calls about this over this time period, and maybe there's been more localised in a certain area. I think that adds tremendous value in a sense in terms of looking at where to start digging, as opposed to saying here are 200 people, exact information of and on all their fine details. I think it'd be incumbent on an agency maybe to come back and ask other specifics we might want to kind of explore further. But I think in the first instance, it would just be on those top level issues to let them work out if there's a wider impact. I think if you looked at 60 CABs across Scotland, you looked at Age Scotland as one of many charities that might be able to get insight from the public. Them getting a big picture, it would help them work out what they need to do with it and where to go.
Just looking at general data.
Sorry.
Christy Kelly, perhaps, before you develop the point further.
What you said there about the network, we can give you the local point of view, because CAS will collate all the overall information, but sometimes an issue that's happening in Aberdeen isn't one that's shared by yourself or vice versa. So we'd be able to give you the more local, and then you can compile that and bring that together. Sorry, I forgot my other thought.
You'll come back to it.
Certain trends within Scotland. are normally flagged up to bureaus by way of calls for evidence by CAS, and we can feed into that. It could be on any particular issue like universal credit or whatever the trend is. We as bureaus then feed in by way of social policy, which are called calls for evidence. So it's something that maybe we could do as well for Consumer Scotland.
I think you've just remembered.
My other point in that is that it would be useful once you've decided what you're going to look at that you let us know, because we'd keep an eye out for those issues, be more mindful of them. It's really difficult for us to go back and try and remember what's happened, or it's not always easy to look through the data we have on people because you have to go in and read every individual case. If we knew you were looking for something specific, it would be easier for that would be in our minds and we would keep an eye out and could give you better information.
So 2 questions arising from that. First is, I can see it might be useful, for example, to have regional information as well as national information, and I'm assuming your systems allow for that. And secondly, coming from what Christy Kelly said, would it be possible to get down to a very local level if it was necessary to do so? Do you have the capability to change systems easily? You know, experience with government seems to indicate that getting statistics is a huge issue if you try to achieve that. Are you in a better position with your systems to be able to do that?
Just to, you're probably better off asking the information systems leads at CAS for this, because they're the ones that collate it. As Christy said, we just send in our stuff. But every case is recorded using, codes for what the issue is, how it's been dealt with, the sort of demographics of the client. So that and we already have a data sharing agreement with CAS, each of us. So that's already in place. I guess what you're talking about is what the data sharing agreement between CAS and Consumer Scotland would be, which is the level above what we see. But certainly what we're collecting and submitting is about individual cases, but does not include identifiable individual information, as Christy said. And this, going back to the sort of organisations that we don't have a lot of staff. In the case of Central Borders, we're overwhelmingly staffed by volunteers, so we don't have the resources available to do lots of deep dive, retrospective data mining for individual cases. But what we can do, as you say, is if this quarter we're interested in funeral poverty, then we will make sure that advisors identify those as they're coming in so that they can be flagged on their way through to the central system. Does that?
No, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Richard Lyle.
Yes, good morning. This bill will create a consumer duty on certain public bodies to have regard to the impact of their strategic decisions on consumers. Do you think this will make a difference in practice or not?
Certainly worth doing, I think. I'm trying to think of really good examples of it, but again, this will boil down to how it's actually implemented or not. But I think if it's not happening just now, then it's certainly something that should do. If they're public bodies, they should be at least looking at the kind of the end user and having the best experience of whatever service or product that they've taken.
I'm slightly worried that it's going to be a bit of a box ticking exercise if you're looking at big organisations like, let's say, Vodafone. How do they achieve something in their annual report that it takes account of the needs of their users, who are, how many millions of them there might be, and do they really get the analogy I would draw on? My background was in NHS management, and it was that sort of the requirement to involve patients, users, carers in your reporting, and it's really, really difficult to do properly because of the diversity you're dealing with, and that's in a local health system. So when you look at a multinational organisation, I'm not quite sure. It would be brilliant, but I'm not quite sure how we arrive at that in any kind of meaningful way.
So, you've heard quite a bit of evidence this morning from I know some of you were in for the first panel. Is there anything else in this bill that you think it should be doing? Is there anything else that you would say to this committee that we should be asking about? Final thoughts?
Got some things in our written evidence which I don't go over in too much depth, but I think it's certainly important that kind of staff and people involved in Consumer Scotland are really aware of the kind of power imbalance that exists in terms of contracts and services with certain people, whether it's engaging in kind of care home contracts, whether it's engaging in funeral services when someone kind of, by virtue of their need, having to go somewhere, maybe not having the time to kind of shop around. So making sure that they're aware of actually how the dynamic works of real people using services. I think we've kind of outlined a bunch of things, and good questions earlier on about digital exclusion as well. I think are really, really important to kind of to highlight, and I think there's a really good example of public service in terms of Social Security Scotland, in terms of how they approach things across face-to-face, in localities, on the phone, on the web, lots of things like that to actually reflect on as a new agency is kind of created.
Anyone else?
Yep.
Lucy?
I'd just like to reiterate we've touched on the sort of value of face-to-face advice. I'd just like to expand that and say that the advantage we have is that it's face-to-face advice from, in our case, overwhelmingly volunteers. And that's about saying it's about trust, I think. It's about, we're in High Street in Galashiels in a grotty shop front, but you go in and there's someone that looks a bit like you that can help you with your problem. So apart from the fact it's brilliant value for money, it's actually about saying it's from the local community helping the local community. And I worry that another layer which is attempting to, or which may inadvertently chip away at that, loses some of that locally based trust and therefore some of its ability to unpick very knotty problems out of a person that just walks through the door.
But you're still, and I would never see any of your shops are grotty, and I think the people
Come
in
and
them
see Galashiels.
I think that I think the people in them are lovely. But basically, you're not getting worried about something which you shouldn't get worried about, because you're going to be on the ground. You're going to be the instant person that somebody can walk in your door and talk to. The other person maybe 40, 60, 100 miles away, so do you not think you're getting worried unnecessarily?
I hope so. The bit that worries me is, I think, as Rory and Derek referred to, if it starts to introduce an extra silo into a system where actually we've got some degree of holistic whole systems thinking, certainly within the bureaus and certainly within CAS. If there's a bit that says, oh, consumer issue, we can't deal with that, you've got to go and talk to those people over there, it's not efficient, it's not effective, and actually, and more importantly, it's not directed towards what the client came in with, which is, I don't care what sort of an issue it is, I just need some help. So that's my worry, but I hope to be
Christy?
wrong.
I just want to add on top of that to say that the role of Consumer Scotland should be to enhance what's already there and make improvements there and fill in some of the gaps, not to erode anything that's already in place.
Thank you very much.
Right, if there are no other further questions from committee members, thank you very much for coming in today, and we'll suspend the meeting and move into private session. Thank you.